Hello, everybody, and welcome to Building Back Regionally. A special welcome to all our delegates and a special thanks to the Association of Colleges for co-hosting this event with us. My name is Michael Lemin. I'm Head of Policy for NCFE. We were due to have our Chief Executive, David Gallagher, speak, but unfortunately he's got another issue he needs to urgently deal with today. So I'm going to introduce the event and do my best to cover what David was going to cover today. We're very excited to be using this interactive events platform, which, as you will have noticed, gives you an opportunity to network at your tables. So at the end of the event, we'll be leaving the platform open for a short time so you can network with others and exchange details if you'd like to do so. Do feel free to move about your tables throughout the event. To give a bit of context to the event, through the government's levelling up agenda, the regions are very, very much in focus at the moment, and we believe this presents a lot of opportunities. Not least locally led economic and skills responses. We seem to be moving towards short, sharp interventions where they are needed in communities, in sectors, and things in the white paper include local skills improvement plans. We're going to see a lot of focus on regional recovery from the economic impact of COVID. In the Tees Valley Combined Authority, we've seen a lot of recent announcements showing the progress which can be made by Combined Authority. There's a Treasury campus coming to Darlington, investment in a vaccine facility. There's a memorandum of understanding with Tees Works for the development of an offshore wind port hub. Middlesbrough and Thornaby have been awarded £46 million from the Towns Fund and funding for intercity transport settlements. This is a crucial time to collaborate across those regions and drive positive change. Look at the regional strengths that we've got. How do we engage with industry providers and identify funding opportunities? How do we work together without competing against each other? I mentioned the local skills improvement plans, and there's very much a suggestion that new legislation will enable the Education Secretary to hold providers to account. So as we move towards local accountability measures, it's very, very essential that skills provision is aligned to the skills needs in a locality. We have grown regional economies, which mean an overall increase in UK economic output and gross value added. And employer engagement in education is very welcome and necessary. Employer and industry inclusion means that skills gaps can be addressed now, throughout COVID recovery, and of course in the future. The outcomes-focused approach in the Skills for Jobs white paper, if implemented, should ensure that learning leads to meaningful employment and can adapt to demand. And clean growth, a key element of almost all regional and local COVID recovery plans as we move towards net zero in 2050. I think everybody can agree that the time to make progress is now. And additional funding is becoming available on a regular basis. We've actually seen £12 billion worth of funding for projects through the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. And appraisal of environmental impact is now included in the Green Book. So as I said, collaboration is key, and that's why we're delighted to have all of you delegates in the room today. And on that note, it's great to have everybody here in attendance. Looking forward to presenting our research findings later on in the event and having a panel discussion on EdTech. And we're going to finish with a closing session from the Chief Executive at the AoC, David Hughes. So very much looking forward to that. But next up, I want to introduce David Corke, who is Director of Education and Skills Policy at the Association of Colleges. Welcome, David.
Hiya. Thanks for having me, Mike. I'm just going to try and share my slides with everybody, so hopefully you can just confirm that you can see those. You able to see those, Michael? Michael, are you able to see my slide?
Yeah, sorry, yes, David, we can see that, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant. Right, so I'm going to just look through the big opportunities and the big challenges falling out of the white paper in terms of regional growth. So from the white paper, there's clearly a big chance to reset the narrative and the relationship between colleges or providers and government. There's clearly some action and the potential for inward investment on clean growth. Obviously, there's lots of opportunity for growing regional economies through work on productivity, innovation, knowledge transfer, and workforce development. Also a big opportunity on the focus, a new and renewed focus on subject-specific enhancement of pedagogic skills. I think of the white paper, the most important element is the funding and accountability reforms, which are, if we get it right, a real chance to improve the operating environment for colleges. And we're very close to this with the department at the moment, and there's a lot of good coming from the funding reforms, and I'm about to sort of explain where I think some of the accountability reforms are going. And then finally, I think a massive opportunity is the much talked about work of Kevin Collins and the Universal Education Recovery Package, which I won't go into today, but there's a huge opportunity to help support young people, especially those that are in more disadvantaged areas. So those are the big opportunities. What are the big challenges? So the local skills improvement plans, it's new legislation, as you said, that will help the Secretary of State hold providers to account should the needs of the local economy not be met. And I think that this could be really problematic. Who will intervene? On what basis? You know, we all know that labour market data is not perfect and structured quite poorly in some places. You know, so what evidence and what direction are we planning this on? LSIPs in themselves point to the future, not to the past. So how do you test this? If you think of it from an Ofsted inspection framework, it would be at odds with the current inspection framework and cycle. Then moving on to, as the white paper mentions, an outcome-focused approach. So we know that they're not talking about outcome payments here, which I think is really good. We highlighted this in a paper for UK CES on outcome agreements quite some time. So it's really good that they're not thinking about outcome-related payments, but outcome measures are definitely being thought about. With the LEOS data set, we have one of the most sophisticated data sets in the world, where we track 98% of people that go through college programs, and we measure whether they go into positive, sustained destinations after 6 months for 6 months, and we look at whether it was positive in terms of moving on to another FE course, or moving into HE, or moving into employments. We also track whether they went into benefits or other parts of the system. Another big challenge is the qualification reforms. You know, we've got lots of focus on a limited range of qualifications. So National Skills Fund is a good example. That the level 3 qualification reforms, if we're not careful, they could these initiatives could damage levelling up. There's lots of collaboration opportunities, but the initiative overload is a massive problem in FE at the moment, and some of these need to be mainstreamed either as funds that are recurrent or mainstreamed into the base rate. And a big question for me, and I know that colleagues that are in the audience will have heard me say this before, but we've got a real issue with a heavily marketized system that's got quite a lot of control, and we're expected to deliver on quite a lot of collaboration, and it's quite difficult to understand what in what world that's the best of. So just want to illustrate why an outcome focused approach is not as good as it sounds, and it's because, and it's really interesting that we've got people from the north, east, and the southwest in the room. Outcome-based success measures are one of those things that are interesting for information for ourselves, for Ofsted and other regulators, but they're quite a lot out of our sphere of control. So take sustained positive destinations in the northeast of 66% versus the sustained positive destinations of the southwest. There's a more than a 10% difference there, and it's not because of the alignment of the provision to the needs of the economy. In fact, there are lots of indicators that say it would be stronger. It's actually about other factors such as unemployment, and I'll illustrate that in a moment. So the sustained employment rate is also quite difficult. So the 57% for the northeast and 69% for the south. For the southwest, and there's a big question here about how we measure different types of institutions. So not every institution's piece of provision is about getting people into positive sustained work. Sometimes it's about getting them to university or helping them with their language skills, and the destination isn't all about work. We're not a completely utilitarian sector. We have to do more than just prepare people for work. It's more than that. There are real issues with positive sustained destinations for some subjects. So look at ESOL at 74%, whereas obviously level 4 is very strong. It's sustained destinations into work, ESOL 56%. We really need ESOL. We really need some of these lower level qualifications that have worse outcomes for employment for obvious reasons. If we get rid of these courses or create perverse incentives through government to remove these, then there'll be real damage to provision and real damage to transitional opportunities. By course, we always get the big differences. So look at things like with NCFE's sort of market. Look at the positive destinations for health and public services right there in the middle of the screen at 87% compared to things like prep for life and work. They're always going to be different. Again, by employment. Again, health is really good, but it's partly because it's such a labour intensive market, and outcomes are always better because there is more work there. If we look at it by deprivation factors, the most deprived at the bottom and the least deprived at the top, the areas with more deprivation are always going to have worse positive destinations and employment destinations. With unemployment, so this is based on JSA counts, with the lowest band at the top and the highest band at the bottom, we know that those areas with high unemployment are always going to have worse outcomes too. Then and worst outcomes for overall positive sustained destinations as well as for the employment rate. I've got just a couple of slides here, and it just if you know these towns, then you know why some are really high performing in terms of local authorities. So this is a list of largely fairly affluent places, and then we've got a list of towns where they are largely less affluent, and so place really matters. And so we need to be really thinking about this when we intervene with institutions. We need to think that we can't just look at data and think that it can lead us down a path of needing to improve a curriculum just through a very straight line instrumental attitude to curriculum planning. So I'll stop there, Michael, and if you've got any questions, happy to take them.
Thank you very much, David. We are just about on time, so I'm afraid we're not going to have time for any questions. But as always, when we see you, David, a lot of insight packed into a very short amount of time there. So thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. So for delegates, we're now going to separate into two groups, which will be the northeast and the west of England, to look in closer detail at the research results for each region. So attendees who are joining from the west of England, can you please join the west of England breakout room? You should be able to click on, I believe it's a blue button, the banner at the top left corner of the screen once we exit presentation mode. For everyone in the northeast, you can stay in this room. Do feel free to move around tables if you wish to network with others. You can move table by clicking on a table where there's a free seat. So when I've got to stop presentation mode and go into our breakout rooms, I'm sure you'll all get a lot out of these research findings. So do enjoy. Thank you. Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Hopefully everybody who's still in this room is here for the Northeast research findings. So we've got a very packed agenda, so I am going to hand you straight over to our head of research at NCFE, Dr. Jansev Jemal, to take us through it. Thanks, Jansev.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm just going to pull up the slides to share. Okay, I'm going to move swiftly on into to tell you a little bit about the background and the objectives for the research. So we conducted this research as part of a wider programme looking at sort of regional engagement. And as part of this study, we chose to focus on two particular regions. One was the northeast of England and the other was the west of England. The idea behind the research was to understand how various stakeholders involved who have some kind of interest in the education process come together to identify skills gaps and or work together in order to address the gaps that they have identified. So in terms of key research objectives, as I said, it was around identifying local skills gaps, employee needs, sector focus, and how this ultimately informs curricular planning and future qualification provision, the extent to which key stakeholder groups work together. And there was also an angle we wanted to sort of understand a bit more on the impact of devolution on the adult education budget. So I'll say a little bit more about that later on. In terms of methodology, the methodology for this was depth interviews. We identified 17 stakeholders from across the two regions. These included FE colleges, independent training providers, employer organisations, representative groups, and we also spoke to representatives from the combined authorities. In terms of timing, it's important to note that we did the research March 2021. So obviously against the backdrop of COVID, and I'll say something towards the end about sort of what we found in terms of the impact of COVID. So in terms of key findings, starting with COVID, actually, what we found is that and this won't come as a surprise to anybody, but COVID-19 accelerated the shift to digital and blended learning, which in some cases was already happening. All stakeholder groups that we spoke to predicted that this will be a permanent change in the sector. Employer engagement is increasingly important in curriculum development. Again, it's probably not a surprise given the emphasis in the policy space on involvement of employers, but employers aren't typically involved in qualification decisions. And I think there's some interesting questions when we think about the future in terms of how employers will engage in that process. What role will they play? At what point will they step in? All stakeholders were eager to support the clear line of progression for learners into higher technical education and support reforms at levels 4 and 5, as announced in the Skills for Jobs white paper. And finally, the research highlighted, in terms of regional differences, some differences in the growth sectors driving the economy and differences in the degree to which providers are working with governing authorities and various stakeholder groups when looking at sort of education and qualification planning. I don't think I'll come on to say more about that as we go. So in terms of when colleges, independent training providers set about deciding how to plan their curriculum, what factors influence their decisions? We've sort of loosely categorized these into some macro factors and other factors. In terms of macro factors, it's important to stress that these are in no particular order. So on the left-hand side, we've got things like employer demand, programs commissioned by governing bodies. Linked to that, and in terms of, if we were ranking this in terms of importance, this is probably a key one. The availability of funding for new income streams is very important in determining what qualifications are developed. National as well as local demand, that came through as a theme. So I think there's something there to bear in mind, that whilst regions and regional planning is incredibly important, the national picture is still influential. The idea of having clear career pathways for learners came through, as did industry recognition of qualification. So I think it's fair to say that, qualifications that achieve that recognition are particularly important in terms of determining what providers will offer. In terms of other factors, so staff expertise and availability was also critical for colleges and independent training providers. Student demand and intended progression routes. I think the question of demand, student demand versus sort of in what employers need, and sort of that external picture is a really interesting one. And I think some of the things that we will come on to shortly will pick up on those themes of demand and student demand, and how that plays with employer needs. And finally, relationship with awarding organisations also came through as a bit of a theme in terms of what qualifications providers will offer. Next, in terms of curriculum planning and forecasting, in terms of where that process starts, we're looking at data, right? So there are two main sources of data for curriculum planning and forecasting that providers use. The first is around government local authority statistics, for example, ONS, local data from local enterprise partnerships, mayoral combined authorities. And secondly, labour market intelligence data, notably EMSI. EMSI was flagged as being a particularly important source. Others that were mentioned included Midas and Vector. Where available, this was mentioned by one of the LEPs, the idea of data on transition and progression of learners. We will come on to talk more about data, but basically in terms of short-term planning, so providers talked about short-term versus longer-term planning. Short-term being 12 to 18 months. That's where the labour market intelligence data was particularly helpful, sort of looking at that in more detail. In terms of the longer term planning, sort of 3 to 5 years, what they are more driven by and looking out for is the trends. So it's the longer term trends that they're seeing in the data. One college in the Northeast talked about having a 5-year strategic partnership that is sort of developed with the LEP, the LEP are involved in that process. Another cited the current influence of current policy, the agenda. So in particular, for example, the Skills for Jobs white paper, the priorities coming out of that, and how that is influencing thinking and shaping sort of what they will do in the coming time. So in terms of the level of engagement between employers or employer organisations and education providers is mixed. Probably not a surprise. There will be some providers who are sort of more established in their relationships with these kinds of groups and stakeholders than others. In terms of some of the challenges influencing that relationship, a couple of things sort of stood out. One was the complexity of the education system with various learner routes, government initiatives and funding streams. This can be challenging for employers. Often they will work in their own specific and have knowledge of their own specific sector. But to try and put that into the context of the wider system and how they can sort of work with a provider in order to sort of try and influence that to everybody's benefit is a challenge. It was also highlighted, the research also found that SMEs versus larger employers, for example, have different needs and priorities. And I think, again, this is something that we can quite easily forget when we talk of employers. We tend to talk about employers as a single entity. It was useful in the discussions to think about actually they're not a single entity. They will have different needs and priorities. We need to find ways of working together which recognises the needs of the different stakeholder groups, even within a type of specific type of stakeholder group. In terms of potential solutions for the challenges that we've just discussed, there was one idea was basically this idea of creating a program or way of engagement which can be presented back to employers for approval or discussion. So going back to the question of what is the role of the employer in this process? How do we best engage them? At what point in the process do we engage them? And what do they want out of this? What works for them, given that ultimately they will have many competing priorities, not less sort of running the organisation that they are running. And secondly is the idea of employer stakeholder groups. This idea, there's probably, and the idea of employee stakeholder groups is probably not a new one. There are groups that are already starting to engage in these types of groups. But ultimately, the way, and they can be hugely beneficial. They can have lots of advantages for everybody taking part, including sort of the sharing of knowledge and expertise. But again, it's going to be about establishing sort of the most streamlined and effective way of engaging everybody to make sure that their time is used well, and that everybody gets something out of it. And that what's not happening is the same sort of types of groups and replicated through different forums. Coming back to the question of data and additional data requirements, something that was discussed. So, for example, if we go back to the influence of LMI data, LMI data is seen as being very useful. However, like all kinds of data, it has its limitations. So, for example, it's useful from the idea of the jobs market perspective, but it's not very good in terms of forecasting learner demand. It tends to be backward looking rather than forward looking. And that's also one of the problems with trying to think about the future and how do we know what we should be doing in the future. Often what's happened in the past is that we use data, past historic data, to try and predict the future. That's all well and good if the future is simply going to keep replicating what's happened in the past. But we're in ever-changing times. The economy is constantly changing, and the nature of the employment sectors are changing within that. And the last 12 months, just over a year with COVID, all that has done is to actually exacerbate some of those changes that were already in progress. Going back to that question of learner demand versus employer needs, this is a really interesting area as well. Learners are constrained in terms of saying what they want by what they know. And in terms of thinking about how actually we can sort of speak to learners about sort of what might be coming down the line, about the kinds of jobs that might be coming and the kinds of skill sets that they would require, and thinking about sort of their interest within the context of both the now, but also what's coming in the near future, I think is an interesting challenge as well. And it's all sort of questions that we need to think about when it comes to the process of planning. Is, if we start to plan for the skills, the jobs that are required for the future, is how do we actually take that back to learners so that they can actually engage with that information and that knowledge. So in terms of future qualification needs, when talking to various stakeholders about what they saw as future development needs, they tended to focus around two areas. One was around digital skills, and the other was, it's gone back. The other was around the opportunities for higher technical qualifications at levels 4 and 5. When it came to digital skills, I think it's important to stress that it's not just about IT and computing, but actually the need to embed digital skills across all kinds of subject areas and sectors that learners might be providing. So it's partly about sort of methodology and not just the subject itself. The other point that came out of that discussion, and it touches on a challenge, a more general challenge, which I will touch on in a moment, but that is the need for qualifications to be timely. So, for example, I mean, it takes a long time. It typically takes, 2 years, up to 2 years to develop a new qualification. If we think specifically about the world of digital in particular, it is moving at a very rapid pace. And so it's a challenge to develop those qualifications, to develop a qualification that is both relevant including for example, the terminology. Terminology changes very, very quickly. And we need to make sure that what comes out at the end of it is going to be as appropriate for that day and time as when we first started to think about that qualification. In terms of high technical qualifications, opportunities, it was flagged about ensuring that there are good opportunities in areas such as STEM subjects, advanced engineering and manufacturing, and that high technical skills will be important for that skills pipeline. It's all well and good having sort of a good vocational technical alternatives to an academic pathway for learners, but we need to be able to follow that through the levels. In terms of potential areas for growth, areas that were flagged in particular are on the screen for you now. In terms of the Northeast in particular, the areas that were flagged were engineering, manufacturing and infrastructure. They were seen as particularly important for the Northeast. Other areas that came out as generally important and needs thinking about was the creative industries, cultural, digital, management skills, professional skills, retail, warehousing and logistics. So in terms of key challenges, there were two general key challenges that emerged out of the discussion and we'll need thinking about. So the first is around funding, and I mentioned this earlier. Development of qualifications is often driven by what governments will fund rather than what skills are needed. I think it may well be the case that we will start to see the two align with the current emphasis on sort of engagement of employers in that process. The two things might naturally start to come together. But otherwise, there may still be a bit of a tension there. And secondly, and I've just been talking about this, is the lead-in time for developing qualifications. It's a challenge for FE providers. It's also a challenge for the awarding organisations. There's a note on the slide there about attracting the right staff. Again, this is true for both the FE providers and the awarding organisation. So when a need is identified for a new qualification, the resources need to be in place. And when I say resources, I also mean sort of the knowledge and the knowledge of the skills required for that area to be able to develop appropriate qualifications. And then in terms of colleges and training providers, they need to have the staff there who can deliver those qualifications. And the more specific the subject area and knowledge and expertise required, the trickier that may become. But it's just something that needs thinking about. And in terms of that time, that lead-in time required, needs to sort of stay at the forefront of the mind. So we've just talked about funding. Moving on to funding in particular, I mentioned at the outset that one of the things the programme wanted to do was to look at what's happened with adult education budgets. So providers have adapted to devolution of AEB funding in mayoral combined authority areas, but there are still some challenges to work through. In terms of what's working well, it was generally felt, discussing with key stakeholders, that it's been a good model for learner outcomes and generally working well within the boundaries of MCA areas. And it's provided a closer relationship between the funder and provider, which is always, it is in many ways very helpful. Local flexibility and responsiveness to community learning needs, e.g. micro provision from non-traditional providers. We did get an example of a food bank in North Tyneside. So there are examples in which that devolution of the funding has been really valuable and helpful. But nevertheless, there have still been challenges. So in terms of challenges, these tended to be around contract management. The initial switch to devolved funding caused some initial disruption in terms of where contracts were rewarded and not rewarded. in terms of some of the examples that were given to us, it did cause some providers who had funding to lose funding, but after sort of some discussions and negotiations, these were slowly resolved. But nevertheless, there were some initial disruptions. Additional bureaucracy for providers working with ESFA and MCA funding streams. So there's just a little bit of extra work there for providers. The more funding streams or external organisations you have to work with, it will add to the workload. Touched on disruption for colleges around the boundaries of MCA areas, or whether there is a demand for programme outside of the region or nationally. So anytime you have boundaries, people talk about, for example, with the NHS, a postcode lottery, it can create a bit of confusion. And the next bullet point touches on this as well, confusion for employees and learners to understand what funding is available depending upon sort of where they live and the boundaries of the MCA. So it's just something to be mindful of. It's unfortunate. But as long as you have a devolved system, these kinds of anomalies and so on can crop up. So it's something to always be mindful of. And I think sort of thinking about, especially sort of where you have neighbouring authorities, it can be helpful for them to sort of have some kind of informal discussions about sort of what one another is doing to try and minimise a situation where if you live one side of the boundary, you may get certain things, and if you live the other side of the boundary, you may get different things. Something else that emerged out of the discussions was the idea of the risk of funding not always being targeted towards unengaged or unemployed learners. This was something given in terms of NCFE and our sort of organisational objectives about focusing on sort of those who are sort of most disadvantaged learners, those who need more support through the system. It was interesting, I think, this for us, and something to think about in terms of how the system is working and who does and doesn't gain under the current system. And so whether whether it's something that we need to be mindful of. And then I just wanted to say a word about sort of regulated versus unregulated qualifications. So I think there is some debate about, the value, the role of regulated versus unregulated qualifications. MCAs see a role for unregulated qualifications in the community learning space, and these are sometimes funded through the adult education budget. In the North East, the general trend has been to move away from unregulated provision. It was felt that publicly funded provision should be regulated, and the place for unregulated is when employers are paying for it. Though there was a suggestion out of the discussions that a potential use of unregulated qualifications is to speed up the development of new qualifications that are emerging in sector areas. So it was a really interesting one. There was clearly sort of a point of principle about if the public are paying for qualifications, then it should be regulated. But there was also some creative thinking around the role of unregulated qualifications, that people do see a role for them, and how they might actually be used to help sort of actually resolve one of the challenges that was identified through the discussions elsewhere around sort of the speed of developing new qualifications. So just to touch on the impact of COVID-19. So we will all be aware that the impact of COVID-19 was predominantly about the method of delivery rather than course content. However, what emerged from the research was that there was evidence of impact, both negative and positive, in terms of course contact. So on the negative, the delivery of practical subject areas such as engineering and manufacturing was impacted. Similarly, with subjects like creatives and arts, it was very difficult to transition certain things online. Several colleges responded quickly on the positive side to increasing their provision for adult retraining and entry to employment, consistent with the MCA priority for COVID-19 recovery. One college even talked about introducing courses on cyber and coding, and another introduced an esports program, thinking very quickly and very rapidly about sort of new course content areas that played on sort of the advantage of the digital and online space. Oh, sorry, it's jumping. A particular area of focus in terms of challenge was reversing the decline in apprenticeship starts. There has been a sharp decline in the number of apprenticeship starts since the first lockdown. Changes in workplace practices due to COVID-19 have put hiring apprenticeships on hold, while onboarding and training can't be done face-to-face. So it has been a very, very difficult environment in terms of apprenticeships. I think it was always, there's always a challenge of completions, and that has just added, the COVID-19 has added to that pressure. One employer organisation talked about the need for a more flexible approach to the levy, including support for businesses too small to pay, but still have a need for traineeships and apprentices. So there's a number of challenges in the apprenticeship space, which people are very it's very top of mind. You know, it is important to have a good vocational route for learners, alternative to the academic pathway, which isn't going to be suitable for everybody. And it's important to ensure that, particularly as we hopefully are slowly coming out of lockdown, to think about sort of how we can either kickstart or sort of provide the impetus again for these programs to support learners to come through them. So briefly, a few key conclusions that came out of the study for us and that we're thinking about. Increasingly, the emphasis in the public policy space is the involvement of various stakeholder groups working together to identify skills gaps and ensuring there is a plan in place to meet those gaps. There is a challenge about the most effective and efficient way to involve groups such as employers in that process, and particularly sort of avoiding duplication and replication for different groups. A word about data. So the presentation itself talked about some of the limitations, some of the useful data sources that are drawn upon to inform qualification development planning, and but they also have their limitations. I didn't go into much detail in the presentation, but the data collected in FE to date has been limited. So, for example, one of the things that has been highlighted by the last year is the lack of data around sort of learner progression, transition and progression. And that's important as part of the whole picture, to be able to have that picture over time. You know, if as an awarding organisation, we think that there are X number of students who are studying X, Y, and Z, and in 12 months' time or in 2 years' time will come out of a programme with these sort of skills and qualifications. If we find at the end of it that we don't have, that our expectations are not met because we've lost people along the way or they struggle with a particular module, if we don't have that information to hand as we go through the program, then it has a knock-on effect for the wider sort of economic picture, as well as for that particular learner in an individual. On subject areas, building green and sustainability themes across all relevant parts of a curriculum and not just in a separate green qualification. I think the same is true for digital, although it's not been referenced on the slide. And finally, another challenge is to investigate ways to speed up the development of qualifications through the development process. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing the slides, and if anybody's got any questions, happy to field any questions.
Thank you very much, Jansev. Yeah, if anyone does have any questions, just if you send them through on the chat, and I'll be sure to put in the Jansev. So I've got a really simple question for you, actually, Jansev, which is, will you be sharing the slides after the event? Are you happy to do that?
Yes, absolutely, no problem at all.
That's great, and we'll also make sure we share David Corke's slides from earlier. A lot of detail on those ones, and I'm sure everyone will appreciate a little bit more time to get through all of that. So yeah, really interesting research findings there, Jansev, and I think that'll lead us on nicely to our panel discussion next. So I think we've got about 2 minutes until the rooms will come back together. So if people do want to kind of leave their desk, have a quick break, get a cup of tea, then now's probably a good time to do that. But in the meantime, we'll stay on and have a bit of a chat, maybe, Jansev, as well.
Sure.
So
Michael, I can see, sorry, on the chat, if I can just pick up on a couple of comments in the chat. So Nav has said another factor is what other local providers are offering. That's an excellent point. And Michael, another Michael has, that was you. Thanks, Michael. You're absolutely spot on, Michael. Coordination will be difficult but beneficial to learners. And I think in terms of making the point about coordination and trying to avoid replication will be to everybody's benefit, but will be a real challenge to make that happen. Yeah, very much so. And it's, I guess it very much lent itself to what David Corke talked about, with that tension between competitiveness and collaboration. Yeah. Got another question here from Kieran. Is there going to be an additional funding towards colleges, authorities, etc. in the Northeast for programs to help young people into work more directly? So I can take that one, Kieran, if you like. It's very much a policy question. I think the frustration is actually a lot of the rhetoric is about locally led places, but what we're seeing in the white paper is most of the new schemes coming through are national schemes. So, things like Kickstart, Restart, they are the lifelong loan guarantee, the lifetime skills guarantee. These are all national entitlements. So, I think there are some chinks of light in the likes of there's going to be ESIF replacement, so potential smaller pots of funding out there, but generally speaking, I think that's another real tension we've got in the policy environment here. So that takes us to the end of this session. I think we're just about on the button there. So we're going to come back together now for a panel discussion. So we'll see you all in a couple of seconds, I think. Hi, everybody, and welcome back. I hope everybody enjoyed hearing about those research findings, and very much leading on from the research findings. As you've heard from that research, we have we've seen an acceleration really in the shift towards digital and blended learning. I think that's a long-standing trend that was really exacerbated by the pandemic. So we're going to look now at what that actually looks like for curriculum design and in the classroom. So as you can see, colleagues joining now for a panel discussion. I'll let the panel introduce themselves, I think. So starting with Janine, please.
Hello, my name's Janine Oliver, and I'm the Head of Assessment Innovation at NCFE. And part of that role is leading the organisation's thinking on assessment for the future, and also the range of technologies that we can use to really make sure that we've got an accessible offer for our customers.
Thanks, Janine. We also have David.
Redden. I am product manager for math, English and digital skills at NCFE. So looking at the overall insight of the qualification, getting customer insight, sector insight, and bringing all that together to make sure that we've got the best products for learners in the market.
And last but certainly not least, we have Leah.
Oh, hi everyone, I'm Leah Grimshaw from Skills Forward. I'm a business development consultant in the Northwest, and we specialise in initial assessment and supporting learners with resources.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to start with an open question for the panel. As I said, the pandemic has really seen an acceleration in the use of EdTech. Do you think this will continue, and how much further do you think we can go?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think what we've seen is, particularly with the larger providers, are certainly looking to switch over to remote delivery. What you're seeing during the pandemic is that, where particularly for work-based learners, the traditional route before was going out to the workplace and a one-on-one session. where as Microsoft and Google and the big platforms are getting much more engaged and interactive, they're able to bring learners together. So whereas one-on-one is now 5 or 10 in an online classroom, the learners are getting peer-to-peer support, it's getting more engaged in the learning, and centres are seeing better results. Now, moving forward into that whole shift in the working environment, more people are going to be working from home. So that means that, you know, it's going to change how people are delivering, and having that remote delivery plan going to be essential, I think.
Thanks, David. Did anybody else come in there?
Just to kind of follow on from that, I think from an assessment perspective, we've seen a really rapid shift in digital assessment methods. So endpoint assessment, for example, in NCFE moved pretty much, I think it was a 4-week period from being able to get adaptations in place and remote invigilation in place to be able to continue with endpoint assessments. I think that moving forward as well, in terms of where we can push and where we can move next, is looking at how we can use AR and VR to really start to look at alternative approaches to face-to-face observations when that's just not an option. So whether that's for a health and safety reason or just because it's not practical for somebody to go out and carry out that face-to-face observation as well. And one of the things I'm really interested in finding out more about over the next couple of months is what it's going to look like next. So we've had a lot of adaptations to qualifications, to endpoint assessment and the way we do things. I think it'll be important to look at what measures that have been put in place now and today that actually are better than the ones we had before, so that we're not falling back.
And from an assessment point of view, we've seen a huge demand in this blended approach to this online learning. I mean, I had organisations that were still using paper-based assessments and paper-based resources. And then because of the pandemic, they've had to decide much earlier to go down the digital route and to make everything online, to make it more accessible for the learners and for the assessors as well. So we've absolutely seen a huge spike in demand, and not only from training providers and colleges, but also from schools as well, that didn't necessarily have anything planned, but then had to put some provision in place quite quickly.
Great stuff. So I think it's fair to say that, you know, not everybody's necessarily ready for this. So how can we encourage learners and indeed staff to engage with technology?
Yeah. Sorry, you go, David.
I think, you know, it's always, before the pandemic, the whole digital delivery was very daunting, particularly for staff. It was a platform that's not been seen before. And then once we got forced into that routine, like we all have on a daily life using these conferencing sites and Teams, we've become more engaged and realize the benefits. But it's also important to note that learners are changing as well. I always use this example, but back in the day, not so long ago, if I had this 500-page Collins manual DIY book, and if I want to do any DIY around the house, I refer back to that. Now I'll go on YouTube to find out how to tile a wall. And it's the same for young learners now come through. They want to find a solution to a math problem or English, how to write English tests. They'll go on YouTube or they'll go online to find that result. So I think, you know, in order to engage that new breed of learner that comes through, staff are going to have to adapt and engage as well. How are they going to do that? And there's lots of new technology that doesn't cost anything to be able to do this. You know, YouTube I mentioned, but stuff like screencast, Microsoft Forms, something similar. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be a brand new shining dazzling system. Something simple as Microsoft Forms can really be engaging. You can set off learner for some question to find out their engagement and then get instant responses by that. So there's different ways. It's keeping it simple, I think, in the first instance.
Yeah, I completely back David and what he says there. I think it's given people a reason to use technology. You'll notice throughout the pandemic, there was lots of people that have never used Zoom before or Teams. I think it was new to quite a lot of us. And then we were using it for family occasions to keep connected with our loved ones. So it just goes to show when you're forced to do something because there's no choice, it becomes part of your everyday and it becomes a means to your living and making your quality of life much better.
Thank you. There's been a question come through from Nav on whether the introduction of DigiTech, do you think we're likely to see a reduction in fees? Now, I can answer that maybe a little bit myself in terms of, I think this year it's actually probably cost us more to offer that because we haven't made savings on the other side of things yet. But of course, it's something we're always looking to pass on savings to our customers where possible. But I do think there's a lot of potential to make the system as a whole more fiscally efficient, I guess. I don't know if anybody else had any thoughts on that.
We probably don't know enough about the impact of technology on actual delivery and costs at the moment to be able to really answer that question. I think as an organisation, though, we have in the past always looked, we're a charity, we have always looked at how we can make efficiencies in delivery and give back to our customers and our learners. So where I wouldn't say I'd be able to give a definite answer, it would definitely be a consideration in our product development and our commercial offer.
Very much so. We've also had a great question from Andrew around inclusivity, and you know, I think you know, his work on digital inclusion has highlighted a large number of people who don't have access to tech and devices that are needed. You know, more broadly, how can we ensure that introducing technology doesn't leave some people behind?
Okay. Can I just pick that one up first, David? Is that right? I think that's kind of one of the things, but one of the other things that I think is a problem is people who have a fear of technology. So I'm sure my mother-in-law would kill me for saying this, but she's a highly experienced midwife who's retired earlier than she wanted to because she couldn't get used to the tech, so the iPads and digital records and things like that. So I think that as we continue to evolve on this journey, we don't just need to be thinking about the technology we're bringing in and making sure we're bringing it in for the right purpose and to add benefit. We're also really thinking about how we're making sure all stakeholders that are going to have to interact with that technology have access to the right training and support, as well as obviously looking at the impact of digital poverty and what we can do as an organisation to support learners so that people who are already most disadvantaged don't become more disadvantaged as a result of our increased use of technology.
Yeah, and I think it's a big concern as well. I think we're talking here a lot about this fourth industrial revolution. It's an age of transformation. It's going to include all different kinds of technologies that we're introducing. And it's also going to change the way we individually work and the way our industries work as well. So it's something we are going to have to absolutely adapt to. And I reiterate Janine's point. I've had a family member, a fantastic receptionist at a well-known firm. They introduced a telephone system. She just found it too complex, too difficult, lack of training, no support, and it made her retire early just because it absolutely scared her to death, the change. And I don't think it was about not embracing the change. I think it was just such a big change so quickly without really looking at what was needed to make sure she knew that made her life easier, and that was going to be a really positive change throughout the company and give her time to do other things that were important, but it wasn't sold into her that way. So I've always had this feeling in my mind that technology is absolutely pointless if you cannot use it. So there's things that you need to really consider with your colleagues or your learners or your workforce even before you invest in very expensive technology. And I wrote down a few points that I thought would be quite useful to people. These are things that I've considered over the last few weeks. I think we have to motivate employees to adopt to a new way of working. It has to be motivational. There has to be a need to show them that it's going to enhance their role or it's going to make their lives easier. I know that's difficult. Lots of people require different amounts of support and different amounts of nurturing. But we can do that by conducting a needs analysis throughout your workforce or throughout your employees to see where you have actually got gaps and strengths and weaknesses within that workforce currently. I also think we need to make things more simple. Start with simplicity. You know, it doesn't have to be the full product sold to you straight away with a 1 hour training session and then you're being left to get it up and running straight away. I think sometimes that is the solution we're giving. Our companies invest in something, they give it to us, they expect us to have 1 hour training session and then they're expecting us to be experts in that within a day. And how many of us didn't really know how to use Teams before the pandemic? I'll put my hand up. I've used it very sparingly throughout the last few years. And now I'm an expert in Teams because I've had to adapt to it because it's made me be able to do my job and it's made my life easier. I also think you need to make sure that that technology is offering an end-to-end solution. So it's easy for the user and it's easy for the person that's getting the results out of it as well. And I think we need to build a coalition of sharing good practice. So maybe trial a pilot. Within that pilot, make sure you've got all different people from different age ranges, different departments, whether that be in retail or logistics. Get them involved in this pilot so they can feedback where they feel people that are at a similar level to them may have problems. They may need further support. They may need a pathway put in place where they're given some additional training. Pilots are a really good way as an organisation before you invest heavily in anything, just to make sure you've crossed all of those barriers that you might come across before you just invest and then implement within a week. And I think the final point is really celebrating success. So within those pilot groups, show through your communication strategies how somebody has adopted. If it's somebody within your workforce, just like my mum who was in her 60s, show how she's embraced technology, show the good practice, get her to share her experience. So it makes other people feel confident in the fact that they're being supported. And I think just finally, other than that, is we need to not only ensure we're putting all these things in place for our workforce or our employees, but I think we need to ensure that our colleagues and assessors, if you're using a training provider, we have to make sure they're fully equipped and they're upskilled. Because how many of us, if you remember the old days when we brought functional skills in, we were asked to deliver functional skills, but I haven't done functional skills for 15 years. I haven't done Maths or English for 15 years. So it was a big shock to be asked to change my way as a practitioner to deliver something that I haven't delivered for very many years. Nobody checked my knowledge, nobody checked my experience, and nobody checked on me within my organisation to make sure I felt confident to go out to employees and support them. And I think that's where we usually go wrong. I think by providing targeted interventions and identifying where improvements can be made in terms of teaching, learning and assessment, that will really make sure we're supporting organisations with our delivery as well.
Thanks, Leah. Mr. Redden, you've been very patient there. Would you like to?
Sorry, David.
Your tea will be drinking temperature, I think, David.
No, just quickly on back of that, is in terms of what Andrew mentioned there about digital poverty, and one thing this pandemic's highlighted is, that lack of digital skills and that lack of digital poverty. The skills area has been addressed with qualifications such as essential digital skills and the new digital functional skills coming in. But what we've seen as well is big tech companies starting to come together. We saw, all the different mobile phone compiling data for schools and colleges through the DFE, DFE rolling out laptops. More of these coalitions, Future.now, are doing great things where they're trying to bundle reuse data allowances and allowing those that haven't got access to access it. So I think in the next year or two, we're going to see a lot of more positive initiatives like that are going to support those who need it most. And I think that's crucial, and it's very important for those big businesses and companies who have a lot of influence and a lot of resource to help those less in need, because we need to take this journey together and no one should be left behind.
Thank you. I'm just going to pick up a couple of quick points from the chat and then ask a sort of final question to wrap up the panel discussion. So Nicola made an excellent point, actually. As much as it's getting kid to learners, the internet connectivity is such a huge barrier still. And I think, we certainly don't have all the solutions yet, but I think if we can keep it in the forefront of all of our minds that access to connectivity is almost as important as, having clean running water and electricity and gas these days. And Kieran also raises the point that a lot of universities in the US have now started offering things like esports courses as an idea to engage people. And I think, again, is a broader point, anything we can do to almost gamify some of this stuff and get people interested in the things that they're already interested in and draw them in to develop their digital skills that way can only really be a good thing. So I just wanted to ask all of you, we've talked a lot about digital assessment today. What are the benefits of digital assessment? Why is it important, and who's it for?
I'll pick up that from an initial assessment perspective. It's very important. It's for everyone, and technology's come such a long way now. It's a great advancement in the fact that it can be accessed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on any device. Years ago, we might have only been able to download assessments on our laptops or on a certain on Google Chrome or Edge, but now we can access it anywhere. So it has become much more readily available. I know there's always going to be issues around connectivity. Yes, assessments do have to be still completed online, usually because of the algorithms built into them, but there are also paper-based versions. I know we're trying to move people into digital era, but where that can't happen, there are paper-based versions available for those learners. So we're not excluding anybody from having assessment. From the perspective of why is it so important? Well, if you've got a workforce with 1,000 employees and you've got apprentices coming in at 16 and you've got a workforce where you've still got 65-year-olds, 70-year-olds working for you, how can you make a judgment on where their gaps are in their knowledge and where their weaknesses and strengths are? By putting every single learner through an assessment, you're completely making sure that everybody is treated fairly and equally, and it's part of a robust quality process. And I think by using data and analytics from these assessments, it really helps you identify where you need to spend your money or your training budget, or where you really need to make sure you're bridging those gaps in your workforce.
Thanks, Leah. David?
I think, yeah, I agree with what Leah was saying there. I think the real opportunity is that flexibility that it offers people. You know, life is very busy these days. Everyone's always rushing around, and the traditional 9 to 5 hours of classroom learning might not suit people, particularly thinking about apprentices and those with adult learners who've got daytime jobs. So the flexibility to be able to sit assessment in your own home, for example, through remote invigilation, or use a platform, that 24/7 online learning platform is essential. I think it's also offers the important thing that you don't use these new technologies for audit purposes only. I think, you know, we're looking at formative assessment, for example. You can really use some of these tools to have effective feedback to learners, really individualized feedback. That's getting in that personal intervention that Ofsted are looking for, like what are you doing for that learner rather than the overall cohort. So I think there's lots of benefits in there around flexibility and an ability to improve learning as well, that whole learning experience. And I think, you know, higher education establishments be using the online platform for quite a lot longer, and we're catching up to that game now. And I think that there's real benefit there if we can get it right.
Thanks, David. And Janine, would you like to have the last word?
I think that kind of just echoing what everybody else has said, but I think it also widens up access as well, opportunities. So if you look at some of the new T-levels that are coming up, and the expectation for work experience, particularly in rural areas, that can be really difficult. But actually, if we can open up experiences that might be kind of virtual as well, and carry out assessment in those kinds of contexts, it just gives more access as well.
Thanks very much, Janine, and so thanks also to Leah and David. I really enjoyed that discussion. I think we could certainly cover off a lot more in the office as well, or follow up from that. So that's great. Thanks very much to the panel. I'll let you sort of turn your mics and cameras off now and get off the stage. We're going to close the event, and just to remind everybody that we will have about 15 minutes at the end of the event if you do want to stay around and network with any of the speakers and delegates from today. But I'd now like to hand over to David Hughes, the Chief Executive of the Association of Colleges, to close the event. So please welcome David.
Cool. Just a bit of delay there as I clicked the buttons and just was hoping it was going to work, and it's worked. It's good to see you. Unfortunately, I've only been able to join this event for the last sort of 10 minutes, so I've kind of missed a lot of the discussion. But there were probably three kind of big messages to kind of share, which are really my reflections on where I think we are at the moment in terms of the government's reform programme, and what I think it means for kind of regions or localities or groupings and collaborations. So if you bear with me on that, three kind of reflections. The first one is, I think we're in a really unique point in time where the government feels to me to have kind of unleashed really an opportunity for colleges and providers and other organisations to work together at a local level. And local, we can determine what that means. It could be regional, it could be sub-regional, it could be a labour market. But at a local level, in order to be able to determine what's needed in a way that I don't think they fully appreciate. So we've had an incredibly centralist, Whitehall-dominated, top-down approach to most policy, possibly forever, but certainly for the last few years. And a good case in point might be the idea of extending entitlement to level 3 through the National Skills Fund, or re-extending it, because they shut it down a number of years ago, didn't they? And then they've suddenly decided that was a bad decision. So they've made a big thing of saying, like, great, everybody's got an entitlement to a first level 3. So in some ways that's quite good. In the budget, they put some money into it, up to 500 million a year, not spending that yet. Things have just started quite slowly. But then determining which qualifications are allowed and which qualifications are not allowed feels to be kind of in 100% in the wrong direction compared to what they've said they want through the Skills Accelerator programme, through the white paper, through the education, skills and post-16 education bill that's before the House of Lords at the moment. So what I think that means is a massive opportunity in a locality through the LSIP process, local skills improvement plan, to say, right, here's a policy, just one piece of policy. NSF, here's the list. Actually, there are some other qualifications at level 3 we want, or there are some modules of those qualifications that we want to be put on the list to be eligible for use of that new money. So that's number one. Number two, we've got loads of adults in our area, because I suspect it's true everywhere, who have already got level 3, might even have a level 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, but actually who could really do with training at level 3, either a full qualification or, you know, a kind of a modules of a qualification, and to make that a regional or local priority. And then go back to government and say, right, you've got to change your policy. You've got to allow us to do this, because you've said you want locally the provision to meet the needs of local people and local employers. This is what it means in our area. And I think we need to really, really push hard on that. And I think we need to do that, not just to sort of show that it matters, but actually because it does matter, you know, because doing it means that, you know, the number of times I've heard over the years from colleges and in the past training providers who said, we can't deliver what this employer wants. We can't deliver what these people need. I just loads and loads and loads of times. So let's pick up all of those and turn them back round and say to government, this is what we need to use this money for. This is what the level 3 entitlements should mean. There are other examples as well. I mean, I think there are lots of examples through the last 20 years where permission has been given to fund short courses, which are very, very kind of labour market focused, a bit like a boot camp in a way, but not so kind of heavily kind of regulated, where an employer is saying we need to employ lots of people with these sorts of skills. Can you, college or provider, go out and start delivering them, and we'll do guaranteed interviews. So let's use it for that as well. And then perhaps even more optimistically or ambitiously, we should also start saying some of the apprenticeship standards aren't quite right to meet local employer needs, because I hear that all the time, where employers say locally, it's all very well having that standard that's been determined nationally by a group of employers, but it doesn't work in my workplace. You know, we want some adaptations to it, perhaps want some flexibility. Maybe we want to bring in a few bits from another standard, or we want to only do 70% of this one, 30% of that one. Why don't we use this opportunity to go back and I think kind of play that game for what everyone actually wants it to achieve, which is much more agile system to meet local learner, community and employer need. And it's all three. Which brings me to the second point, which is about the local skills improvement plans. So I'm quite worried in many ways, so I'll be really candid about it, that you could envisage a world in which a sort of newly designated employer representative body goes away and actually doesn't represent fully all employers in an area. it's a big job. You know, there will be tens of thousands of employers in any local area. It's really hard to represent all of their interests. It could be that would result in some slightly odd outcomes. And what we need, therefore, two things, I think. One is some clear accountability mechanisms and expectations on what an LSIP process looks like. What data will you take into account? What LMI will you use? How will you engage employers? Which employers are you going to try and get out to? Which sectors are you going to look at? Are you going to do it as a blanket? Are you going to... So I think there's a whole set of expectations that I would encourage everybody to engage in locally to try and get it right, because it's in everybody's interest to get it right, rather than to say, well, that wasn't a very good process, we don't like the plan. Much better get the process right, like the plan, use the plan to get the flexibilities that meet the needs, in my view. So that's one thing. And then there's a second thing about LSIPs, which is I've never thought that the system should be driven just by what employers say they want. I don't think that's what the government really wants. They say they want that, but actually I think the reality is far from that. What I think we need is a balance, really. The employer voice and the labour market signals are incredibly important and need to be absolutely articulated clearly, but we'll never get 100% agreement on that, because there are lots and lots of competing voices and tensions. But I think that LSIP, you know, organisations, the employer representative bodies, also need to then engage with providers. They need to engage with colleges and ITP and adult ed providers to make sure that there are other voices in this, particularly the learner voice, particularly an understanding of where learners are participating and where they're not. Which are the postcode areas that in an area, in a locality, that need to be focused on, and how do we kind of how do colleges and providers locally reach out and get those voices and feed that into what has to become a partnership agreement, I think, on what are the needs that are priority and how do we go about meeting them. And then beyond that, I think we then start to think about, okay, that might say, for instance, that we need more people to go into sort of, you know, kind of green skills and green industries, for instance. It might say we need people to move in, you know, more people to be trained in advanced manufacturing, in certain construction trades, in digital construction, in green skills in construction, in logistics. You know, there'll be a whole range of things which will be fairly common. Health will feature incredibly highly, I suspect, in every part of the country. So there'll be a number of those. The issue then is, how do people work together in a locality? And by people, I mean college, ITPs, universities, local government, kind of major employer organisations, major employers, third sector, and so on. How do they work together to stimulate the demand? Because I similarly don't buy into this idea that once you articulate what's needed and say to providers, go away and deliver what's needed, that's the end of the story. It's really only the beginning, because, you know, it's not employers who participate in learning, it's individuals, and we've got to get to individuals to explain to them why some courses might be more advantageous to them than others. So there's a big IAG part in that, which is not just the normal kind of one-to-one IAG. I think it's a real kind of locality communication about what's needed in an area, sending signals to people who might already be in work, might be in school or college, might be in university, about the sorts of skills that will be helpful and useful, and let's face it, lucrative in the labour market, because I think that's what drives. And then final thing I'd say, and I'd be interested in some feedback, is I think there's some massive opportunity on the horizon as well. So we've got things like the Level 3 National Skills Fund. We've got some growth in Level 4, 5 higher technical quals. We've got the rollout of T levels and so on. So there's quite a lot going on. But the really big thing on the horizon for me is the lifelong loan entitlement, which, if it's done properly, if it's done well, could be a big game changer. And I think we've got to, again, get feedback from localities around the country about, well, what would be useful in the way that's designed? What do we want it to be used for? How do we sell it? How do we overcome probably the reluctance of lots of adults to take out loans? How do we make sure it's inclusive? How do we reach communities who might be particularly loath to take out loans or cautious? I'm thinking, particularly about people on lower incomes who might be much more debt averse and risk averse and might be less confident about their learning and their potential. How do we use that and how do we feed that back? So, I come back to my first point. I think these reforms in some ways look like Whitehall trying to flex its muscles. But actually, I think what they've done is they've unleashed a real potential for a much more kind of devolved system in which at local level, you've got the opportunity to say, this is what we need to do, and we'll just get on and do it. And you, Whitehall, you funding agency, you DFE, have to support us to do it because you've said you want us to meet local need. This is how we meet local need. And here's the proof. Here's the plan. Here's the articulation from employers. Here are the pathways that work for students, and this is what we're going to do. And I think we should all take real heart from that. But we really need to seize the moment because governments are pretty impatient about change. What they want to see, I think, is some real movement and proper joined up collaboration between groups of providers, yes, groups of colleges, yes, but also with employers and with other organisations. So I think we're on a really exciting time. I think there's all sorts of barriers, hurdles, bumpy roads, lack of resources, all of those sorts of things that we could say get in the way. But I think the sorts of leaders I know exist in this sector are very focused on trying to get things done, very pragmatic, very practical, very realistic, grounded. So let's just get on with it. Let's make it happen. Let's use the can-do attitude that I think epitomises our sector when it's at its best, and just get on with it and keep challenging the system at national level to flex to meet local need rather than having to do the opposite, which is what I think we've been doing at local level probably for at least 15 years, possibly for a lot longer. So I'll leave it there, and I'm really interested in any questions or thoughts or responses. But we'll equally might be able to finish early.
Great, thanks very much, David. If I think we've got about a minute or so left, so if there's any points come through in the chat, then do send them through. But we will be staying around for around about 15 minutes afterwards if anybody kind of wants to come on and discuss a bit more informally. So I just want to thank all of our delegates for attending today. I really hope you got as much out of it as I did personally, and very special thanks to David and the AoC for supporting and co-hosting the event with us. It really is much appreciated. So we'll come out of presentation mode now and join our tables for a bit of informal discussion. So thanks very much, everybody, and look forward to some discussion.